everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 4th, 2019, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Remember, Talk Nerdyism will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support from listeners just like you. So at the top of the show today, I want to give a shout out to Ulrika Hagman, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Dudas Infinitas, Phil T-Bear, The Zombie Drummer, David J.E. Smith, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. Thank you all so much for your support of the show. All right, guys, this week is a really interesting topic. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Miriam Barlow. Now, she's a professor at UC Merced, and she is in the molecular cell biology group looking at the evolution of bacteria, specifically with regard to antibiotic resistance. I learned an awful lot from her. I know you will too. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Miriam Barlow. Well, Miriam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on your show, Cara.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to talk to you about, I think, for me personally, one of the most fascinating kind of topics in sort of biology research that especially affects, I think, everybody on the planet. When I'm doing my other show, The Skeptic's Guide, I often will want to cover these kinds of stories because we cover like current news articles. And I often want to cover antibiotic resistance stories because I just think that they're so incredibly important. And so I'm very excited to talk to a researcher who specializes in and focuses on antibiotic resistance.
Thank you so much for your interest in this topic and in my research. It's nice that there are people paying attention to this important problem.
Absolutely. And I think it's getting to the fact or getting to the place now where, I don't know, I mean, maybe you know better. I'm not sure if you've looked at any kind of science communication research or any like public health kind of Gallup polls. I don't even know if anything like that exists about people's knowledge about antibiotic resistance. But it does seem like people are kind of aware of the problem now when maybe they weren't so much a while back. They might not understand the scope though, right?
For the most part, people seem aware. I think one of the most encouraging things was that in Europe, this was quite a few years ago now, but the Longitude Prize was this huge cash prize that was announced to try to solve one of the world's problems. And they were looking at things like clean water and human trafficking and this kind of stuff. And people, and they're all huge problems. And antibiotic resistance was one of them. And my mom was like, "Oh my gosh, Miriam, you have to see what's going on here with this prize. Maybe antibiotic resistance will be the thing that people choose." And I was like, no, these other problems are so huge. There's no way. And then everybody voted that they wanted to solve antibiotic resistance as the major problem that they wanted this money to go towards solving. And so I think that was a huge indication that the public is really concerned about this. Now, that is a European award, and that's the European public. But I think that in the U.S., there are similar concerns going on.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it. It seems like most people have a general conception that there are antibiotics that have become resistant. People understand that, you know, a superbug is a thing, even if they don't fully get, grasp what that is. But I'm not sure if the causes are really well understood or really, like I mentioned, like the scope of the concern is really well understood. So maybe before we get into the brass tacks, you can tell me a little bit about your lab and the work that you do. So you're a professor at UC Merced, which is the same university where we had recently on the show Sora Kim, who is a professor in an environmental group where she studies stable isotopes in shark teeth to understand climate change, which is so cool. So it's a totally different department, totally different area. But it sounds like you guys have some really amazing research going on over there at Merced.
Thank you. Yeah, we do. We have really good researchers here, and thank you for recognizing that. So you want to hear about my research some?
Yeah, like what are you studying currently? Like what are some of the projects that you're currently on?
So right now, we're trying to figure out a way to make off-patent antibiotics useful again. So usually within 3 years of an antibiotic getting introduced into clinical use, there is resistance to it. And then within a couple of years after that, then usually resistance to that antibiotic has spread throughout the entire world. And then after the after an antibiotic is used long enough that it's coming off of patent, and usually well before it comes off of patent, resistance to that antibiotic is so prevalent in bacterial populations that it's just not useful very reliably anymore. It might still be good for things that are not life-threatening with the hope that they work, but it's probably not going to be the first antibiotic that you would choose for somebody who's coming into the hospital very sick with like a bloodborne infection or something. And so we're looking at ways that to bring these off-patent antibiotics back to being useful again. And so the way that we're doing this is by understanding how resistance to them evolved in the first place. And whenever resistance to an antibiotic is evolving, it's because this antibiotic is applying a really strong selective pressure to bacteria. If they don't become resistant to this antibiotic, they are just dead. And so any bacterium that becomes resistant, that gets a mutation that makes it resistant to this new antibiotic or to this antibiotic, is going to be much faster at growing in populations. It's going to be much better at surviving, and these are going to become the dominant bacteria. But as they become the dominant bacteria, there's usually something that they lose too. So in becoming resistant to one antibiotic, they might lose susceptibility to another antibiotic. And so we've been working in my lab to just measure all of these trade-offs in resistance that happen. And we've measured lots of them. And then we developed a math model called Time Machine to go and look at the trade-offs that are there and to find the work. I want to restate one thing about Time Machine. So we developed a program called Time Machine with Bernd Sturmfels, who's a mathematician at Max Planck in Germany. And he was really the brains behind that program. And I don't want to take credit for that. But so Bernd Sturmfels developed with us this math program, looking at all of these trade-offs in resistance that are happening to bacteria, and then finding the most probable sequence of antibiotics to reverse the evolution of antibiotic resistance. And we found lots of sequences that can do that. There were none that did it with 100% probability, but they do it like with 60% probability, which is a whole lot better than the current situation. We can at least see reversals more than half of the time. And so all of this was done in the lab, in a computer, and in theory, the whole thing works. And so we published this. It got a lot of excitement, a lot of attention. And then people started asking questions like, so when are you going to start implementing this? And, of course, we want to implement it right away. And we're working with Mercy Medical Center, our local hospital, and they are great partners to work with. And we're looking at their bacteria, and maybe we'll be able to try this out in their hospital at some point. But we started asking the question, okay, when can we implement this? But then it really became this question of how can we implement this? Mm-hmm. And what's the appropriate scale to implement this approach? And so people have tried to do systematic prescription of antibiotics in hospitals already. And their approach was kind of different than ours was. And it hasn't worked very well. And we're not sure if that's because the hospital, because their approach was different than ours, or because the hospital is just getting so many bacteria coming in from outside that trying to control what's happening just within the hospital may not be a big enough scale to really try to manage this on. And so we kind of had to back up and go, if we're going to try to reverse the evolution of resistance, even within one hospital, what is our target population of bacteria? So like in Merced, we have a lot of agriculture going on, and there are potentially much, much higher levels of antibiotics being used agriculturally than in hospitals or even in outpatient prescriptions. And so maybe a lot of the resistance we're seeing is actually coming in from agricultural sources. Maybe it's coming in from just resistance that's evolved in the community. Maybe it's coming in from a national level where it's just, this is kind of on average what's happening nationwide, and we're just kind of reflecting national trends. And so we've been spending the past couple of years trying to identify what outside factors and internal factors are influencing antibiotic resistance in our local hospital. And the good news is it looks like some of it is probably controlled by use of antibiotics within the hospital. And the bad news is that most of it seems to be controlled by outside factors. And so now we're starting to compare what's happening in the local hospital with what's happening at a national level. And so we're going into all these databases where people record, where scientists and doctors are recording resistant isolates, and sometimes they're sequencing them and making their genomes available. And we can start to see what's happening at a national level. And so right now, one of the current projects we have going on is comparing what's happening locally to what's happening nationally. And they're not identical, but there are some strong parallels. So if we're ever going to reverse resistance, we might need to take this on at local levels and also national levels at the same time. And I'm not sure, I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not sure what it would take to do that. But I feel like as we even start to figure out the levels at which interventions need to happen, then that at least gives us the information to start responding correctly to antibiotic resistance.
That's fascinating. I mean, I'd love to kind of drill down a little bit deeper into this kind of reversing of evolution. But I think maybe before we do, we could do sort of a nuts and bolts of antibiotic resistance. Like, why and how do antibiotics become resistant? So it's really, tell me if I'm wrong, it's really a function of the genes inside of the bacteria, right, that are becoming resistant.
Yes. There are a lot of genes that contribute to antibiotic resistance, and some of them are there in the chromosomes of bacteria, so the DNA that they just carry around with them all the time. And sometimes you just mutate some little segment of DNA and it just turns this gene on, and then suddenly they're resistant to an antibiotic. The other thing that happens, and that's actually quite a bit scarier, is that bacteria can pass resistance genes around among each other. And so they have little mobile pieces of DNA that are called plasmids. And these, they can transfer to each other. So they stick out these little tubes off of the sides of the bacteria called pili. And they're just kind of like straws sticking out, but they're also like fishing lines. And so they'll catch other bacteria as they go by, and then they kind of reel them in. The little straw gets shorter, but there's this tube that is connecting the bacteria to each other. And after they reel these bacteria in, then this plasmid that they have that potentially has a lot of resistance genes on it gets transferred from one bacteria to another, but it stays in the one that donated it to. So both of them in the end have this plasmid with antibiotic resistance genes on it. And then suddenly you have a bacterial strain that was completely susceptible to antibiotics become potentially untreatable by antibiotics, depending on which resistance genes it has. And so it spreads super quickly. And then as antibiotics continue to be used, there's just all this selective pressure, because if you've got this plasmid, you're going to survive. And if you don't have it, you're going to die. And so, of course, very rapidly, everybody who is left in the population has this plasmid.
Yeah. So when we think about selection pressure, right, like Darwinian natural selection, that's really what it is. It's all about survival of the fittest. These organisms that can produce viable offspring are going to be most likely to produce viable offspring by virtue of the fact that the other ones that die too young can't pass on their genes.
Yep, that's it. And it's a really powerful factor with bacterial populations because they can reproduce so quickly. So, with like human populations, you see these things and maybe in 8 lifetimes you see some really big changes that have happened. But with bacteria, you can see really, I mean, they can potentially have a generation every 20 minutes to an hour out in the wild in nature. Maybe it's like once a day, but that still is this really fast, 8 lifetimes for them occurs in 8 days instead of.
Hundreds of years. Yeah. And so to be clear, it's when we're talking about selection pressure and we're talking about specifically the resistance that develops in bacteria, some of the habits and some of the behaviors that we as consumers, whether it's us taking a prescribed antibiotic or whether it's the way that we feed our livestock antibiotics, that is not actually inducing the resistance, but it's causing the resistance to spread like wildfire. The resistance itself is a fluke, right?
Yeah, it's just this random thing that happens. Maybe there are genes out there already that bacteria have had forever that they can set, but they're at really low frequencies. It's a super rare thing, and then all of a sudden they just start spreading it around, and then everybody has it, and then they're all resistant. Or sometimes you have totally new mutations or genes that did something totally different that are being co-opted to now cause resistance. But it spreads no matter how it arises. It spreads really quickly, pretty much every time.
Yeah, and that's, mostly due to the fact that we're taking such, large quantities of drugs to try to kill these little buggers, right? Whether it's in people or animals.
Uh-huh. One of the most encouraging things that's happened in California, I think, was that McDonald's at some point, and they are the largest customer of foster farms, and they said we need chicken for our food at McDonald's that has been raised without antibiotics because that's what our consumers want. And so then foster farms suddenly had pressure put on them, financial pressure put on them to eliminate antibiotics from their chicken production, which then has put pressure on other markets within California to start eliminating antibiotics from farming animals. And so these are huge changes.
And really important changes. I mean, obviously, if the animals are sick, farmers still can use antibiotics for health. But previously, especially in chickens, we used antibiotics because a long time ago we discovered that when you dose a chicken with antibiotics, it gets bigger faster, and that's bad.
Yes, and then also I think sometimes animals are held at such high density that it's probably really fast for infections to spread through them too. And so by eliminating antibiotics, there may have to be this second look at what our agricultural practices actually are. I mean, it's hard on farmers when these kinds of changes come into place because you have to reevaluate all your practices but I think that the costs to farmers, it's probably worthwhile to society as a whole. And I applaud the ones that are doing this. It's responsible and it's good for society now and good for the future and good for human health.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about when somebody reads a label that says antibiotic free or these animals, this milk was produced without the use of antibiotics, whatever the case may be. I think that there's probably a portion of the population that looks at that and thinks like, oh, good, because the antibiotics, gross. Or like, ooh, this seems more clean or more natural or, all the buzzwords that you see. But it's really not about like, kind of quelling any sort of concerns about whether or not it's quote unquote natural. The issue here is that antibiotic use in farm animals massively contributes to resistance in all populations.
It does. And that resistance can spread to humans by consuming food. And I've been talking with some other scientists, just kind of casually, but there are starting to be ideas around there that a lot of the resistant infections that we're seeing are actually coming out of food, and that the
Wow.
resistance might be coming from food. And so when you go and you have, say, a urinary tract infection that is resistant to antibiotics and difficult to treat, which is a super common thing in elderly populations, that resistance and that urinary tract infection may have been foodborne and then has come into human populations that way.
No way. I had no idea. Okay, so I said to you offline before we got started that I'm currently taking an antibiotic right now. Um because I have, sorry guys, TMI, but I have a UTI right now. And so I got tested. I mean, I knew I had one because the symptoms are very specific. Most women are very well aware of what a UTI feels like. They're much more common in women. Yeah, we've all been there. We know exactly what it feels like. So I went to the clinic and I told them, my symptoms, and then they did a urinalysis. I guess they have some sort of rapid reagent test, and we're like, "Yep, it's positive." So we're going to start you on the classic UTI antibiotic, which is like, can't even remember what it's called. The little, I remembered even from years ago. Oh, the little black and yellow pill. And I'm on that now, but they said they would call me in a couple of days after they've done an assay in a lab off site to determine whether or not it's resistant.
Oh, you have a good doctor. They tested
Yeah.
your sample for resistance right away and didn't wait for treatment failure.
Yeah, he's like, we'll start you on the first line of treatment, which is the classic, drug that everybody takes for a UTI, but then we'll make sure it's right for you by testing whether or not your bacteria is resistant to it, which is awesome. But I doubt that's common, huh?
I think it's getting more common, but it brings
Yay.
joy to my soul. I feel like you have a good doctor. I'm like, and that's what the healthcare system
Good.
should look like.
Yeah.
And sometimes it does.
Oh, very good. Very good. So this is kind of, though, what we're going to have to start dealing with almost every single bacterial infection, isn't it? Like I've been, trying to keep up with the literature a little bit. And I think a lot of us know about MRSA, and we could talk about that specifically methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus.
Yeah.
And the only reason I'm relatively well versed in MRSA is because I've had MRSA and it was horrible. Yeah, luckily it was community acquired and not hospital acquired, but it was still pretty horrible. But then beyond that, I've been reading articles that there are like strains of gonorrhea that have no defenses against them anymore. Like there's not a drug on the market. Like, what do you do?
Yes. And last I was aware, it had not yet hit the US, but had been seen in Canada. So it's close. And in Japan, I believe people were looking at treating it with chemotherapeutic agents.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, because if there's no antibiotic, what do you do? Like, I think we're so used to antibiotics being just this simple, low hanging fruit treatment without realizing that in a pre antibiotic era, which none of us lived through, you died of very basic things, very simple infections because we didn't have treatments.
Right. It's really scary, the situation that's coming up. And I mean, gonorrhea it certainly is something that you want to get treated if you have it. But there are more serious infections that are out there too. I mean, there was a woman in Reno who got an infection with the New Delhi metallobetalactamase. I believe she contracted it in India, and then she came back to the States, and it killed her in the hospital. And there was just nothing that could treat it anymore. And I mean, especially as people go abroad, they need to be really careful about staying healthy, and if they hurt themselves, taking care of that really fast before it gets infected. And if you're seriously injured, maybe coming back home. It worries me the things that are happening in the United States, but it worries me too the things that are happening globally. And people need to be really careful. I mean, avoid getting resistant gonorrhea. Use condoms, or like
Yeah.
have do what you can to have a low risk lifestyle. And people need to start being very proactive about making sure that they're just not getting infections to begin with. I mean, you got to still
Yeah.
go and live your life, but if there are responsible things that you can do while living your life, absolutely do them.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've just been living for so long, kind of the last few generations that living for so long with the convenience of antibiotics and historically antibiotics working like a champ, just not having to deal with a lot of resistance when they were new. And so I think people are used to being able to be a little bit more risky because they're like, oh, I'll just take a pill and it'll clear it. And
Right.
that's not the case anymore. Like we have to understand that. And there's not a lot of incentive for drug companies to produce new antibiotics because they don't really make them a lot of money. There's, like you said, probably one of the biggest issues right now is that we live in a global society, but we don't necessarily have all the best global health diplomacy. I think some countries are really great about it, others less so. And so, we're a global society, but we each have different governments and our governments handle things differently and they don't always talk to each other. And that can be a real problem.
In some parts of the world, there are no regulations on antibiotics being used or even produced. And in those parts of the world where sometimes you see in international reports, you see really potent antibiotics that you would think of as last resort antibiotics for like a dying person or a very seriously infected person. You see them being used agriculturally in massive quantities, and that scares me a lot. And that's something where a country can do that, and they can just say, look, we just don't have whatever the infrastructure in place to regulate this, or we're just not concerned with this problem. But the whole world does experience the impacts of those practices. And unfortunately, also in countries where this sort of thing is happening, there are starting to be research articles coming out of these countries that are giving us an indication of what's happening, but there's not even really good monitoring of the situation. I think that there's a lot going on that we have no concept of in terms of antibiotic production and consumption. This isn't this isn't a thing that's worth going to war over, but it is a thing where in international summits or meetings of leaders, I think that there does need to be a dialogue about what's happening, and that there should be some pressure, and I don't know exactly the right place for it to come from, but there should be some pressure, I think, on countries to adopt harmonious antibiotic practices or compatible ones. And I know the World Health Organization does apply some pressure for that, and maybe they just don't have the leverage they need to be able to do this in every single place. But it certainly is an international problem, and one that we need to start seeing the world's nations coming together on.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, obviously, these are big issues that are going to require, like you said, some real diplomacy and world leaders really coming together and trying to understand these public health issues. Talking to physicians and researchers and public health advocates. I'm wondering, kind of at the more maybe local or individual level, what are the kinds of things that individual consumers like you and like I can do to be more empowered to be making, the right decisions with regards to resistance?
I think that there are a lot of things that we can do. I mean, we talked about how McDonald's applied pressure to get rid of some of the agricultural consumption of antibiotics. And as consumers, purchasing products that were produced in an antibiotic-free environment or without antibiotics, those are good things to be doing. And that's, even if those products cost a little bit more, I think that it's worth it to pay a little bit more to apply pressure to prevent the antibiotic resistance problem. I think that other things that we can do as individuals are to keep ourselves healthy. This includes things just like general health, maybe getting a flu shot so that you don't get the flu and then pick up some secondary infection. Being a healthy weight, being fit, those are things that can help improve the immune system, help keep us healthy. And then, maybe you get to avoid surgeries or things like that where you could contract antibiotic-resistant infections in a hospital. In general, the more you can stay out of a hospital, the less likely you are going to be to get a resistant infection. Of course, since antibiotics and very strong and powerful antibiotics are used in hospitals, those are often the places where some of the worst infections are. And so I think, like in my grandparents' generation, there was sort of this idea that you go to the hospital as a place to get well. And at this point, hospitals are a pretty high risk place. If you need to be in a hospital, absolutely be in a hospital. And reasons for needing to be there would be the doctors who are there and present and able to very quickly provide medical services, and then also the equipment that's in a hospital, and a skilled nursing staff that's there around the clock. Those are great reasons to be in a hospital, but if you don't have to be in a hospital, it's probably a good thing to go home and work on getting better at home. I think other things, there's this gonorrhea infection. So avoiding contracting gonorrhea, using responsible practices to avoid picking up sexually transmitted infections. That's a great way of helping to prevent antibiotic resistance. If you get cuts or abrasions, like a skinned knee is a great way to get MRSA. Abrasions are really great infection sites because there's so much skin that's open there. And so when things like that happen, keep them clean, keep them bandaged, and be responsible about just helping your body to heal itself when something like that does happen. And I think another one that's really important is just like managing stress levels, because when you get too stressed out, your immune system kind of tanks, and then you can get really sick then. And I've had friends who have been really stressed out and they, cut themselves shaving or, just get an abrasion on their skin somewhere, and they end up hospitalized for it because they get such a bad infection and maybe it's resistant to antibiotics. And so then they need to be on an IV for it. It's terrible. And I think that when you start getting to a point where you're really stressed out and getting sick, it really is worth going. Can the world get on without me right now? And you might think the answer is no, but maybe it's better to take a few days or a week off than to really get so sick that maybe the world has to get on without you for a long time or even permanently. And so just all of these things that we know we should do to keep ourselves healthy, even if it's not directly related to infections or antibiotic resistance, all those things are really powerful ways of fighting antibiotic resistance just for ourselves. The healthier we can be, the less likely we are to get it.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. It's funny because it seems kind of simple almost. And I think it's one of those things that, unfortunately, do you ever have this experience when you are sick? So right now I'm struggling with a UTI and I have some symptoms of it, but I've been on antibiotics for a few days and I'm actually starting to feel better. So yeah, good. But I remember for the first couple of days, or maybe even just the first day, feeling like, I have to appreciate when I'm well. I don't do enough, kind of soul searching and realizing when I'm well, how good I have it, because you almost don't think about your health until your health is threatened. It's like we've got to be aware of it even when we're in a good place.
Yes, I think so. And really actively taking steps to maintain it. It was, now maybe 2 years ago, but I was so stressed out with work and just not getting enough sleep. And anyway, and I ended up getting shingles, which, it's chicken pox with a vengeance in your 40s. And that's still like the place where when you get shingles, the virus comes out of your nerve tracts up to your skin and makes this rash. And I still have this little spot on my torso where it came out of the nerve tracts, and it still itches and hurts sometimes. And that's kind of my reminder. Like, I hate that happened to me, but I still, it's like this constant reminder. And so when I'm not taking care of my health and I notice that itching or hurting a little bit, I just go, it's time to slow down. You don't you have experienced this, and it's just this constant reminder. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I can, the world can get on without me this afternoon. The world can get on without me between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I can go to bed. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's good to remind ourselves of those things. And, maybe we get something done a little bit late, or maybe somebody's a little bit upset with us or something if we're really that swamped and just don't have enough time to get everything done.
Yeah.
But I think that the consequences to our health are just huge. Our health is worth it's. I'd rather have a person a little bit mad at me probably than have this like painful place where shingles hit me for hopefully that goes away at some point. It's getting better, but it's just like somebody being upset with you lasts, maybe a day or even a week, and then it's kind of over. But if your health is compromised, that goes on and on and on sometimes.
I'm so glad that you're talking about, self-care, and you're talking about this kind of balance and ensuring that you're doing well, because I don't think that we talk about that enough. I think that we're always so concerned about productivity, especially in our culture, that really does take a backseat. But in addition to self-care, which is so important, I think also we don't do enough. Kind of the productivity pressure is so high that we don't often do a good job of not putting others at risk. Like, don't go to work if you're sick. People do it all the time. They go to work and they get on airplanes all the time when they're like actively infectious.
Yes, and there are some things that they could do to maybe help with that. One, not going to work or getting on the plane. But two, even if you do, in Japan when you're there, everybody's wearing a mask. And it's this very Japanese thing. And but then supposedly people do this when they get sick. And maybe they do it to prevent themselves from getting sick, but supposedly when people are coming down with a cold, that's when they're putting masks on, and it's to help not spread the cold. Now, of course, you need like a good mask that's actually going to block things from spreading if you cough or something.
Yeah.
But I've started noticing that happening in California, and I'm not certain how much this is going to positively affect health. But I think that it's encouraging that people are at least willing to make some effort to not infect everybody. Because a lot of times, students who work in my lab, they'll go, I'm sick, but I'm taking like cold medicine so I can still come in and work. And you just kind of like, just stay home. I don't want to get sick too.
Yeah. And also, like, there are times when it's very clear. I think, like for women, for example, symptoms of a UTI, symptoms of a yeast infection, for example, those two things are like the symptomatology is very clear. But there are other times when you just generally feel crappy, or like your throat hurts, or you have like a little bit of a cough, and you have no idea if it's viral, if it's bacterial. You have no idea if the treatment, the over-the-counter stuff that you're taking, is simply just masking the symptoms of the actual infection. So you're actually getting worse, but you can't tell because you're masking your symptoms. Or if you are getting better. And of course, if you're wanting to get well, you need sleep, you need food, you need fluid, you need rest. You don't need to go to work.
No, and maybe you don't need to go visit family members too. I've given my dad
Yeah.
like pneumonia twice. It
Oh
wasn't
no.
pneumonia in me, but it's like I have this bad cold, and they're like, "Oh, just come on anyway. We'll take you sick." And then
Yeah.
like 2 weeks later, my dad's like, "So I was diagnosed with pneumonia today." I'm like, "Oh, I hate it so much."
Right. Yeah. Because they're older and their immune systems are not as strong as ours.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of getting to this point where if I'm feeling sick, probably I'm going to delay going and visiting my parents. And I love to see them, but it's just I don't want to put them in the hospital. That's not the way I want to show them my love.
Yeah, and I think we really do need to see some actual kind of societal change, some change with our ethos so that when somebody does call in sick, we look at that as a responsible decision and not as like being weak or being lazy or trying to wiggle out of work, you know? I
Yeah,
think that
or
we
taking a day in the city or
yeah,
whatever.
like we look at adults the same way we look at children who are trying to not go to school. You know what I mean? And it's like,
Yes.
no, I think that most adults have a very strong internal drive to do their jobs and to do their jobs well. And maybe we should just accept that if somebody says, I'm very ill and I'm not coming in, that things aren't going so well for them. And we should say, thank you for not getting me sick.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so these are some things that we can do to prevent kind of the spread of antibiotic resistance. But the truth of the matter is, antibiotic resistance is here. It's not going anywhere. So now it's about mitigation and potential, research and actions that we can take to effectively maybe reverse or mitigate or potentially reverse these issues. So, let's get back into some of the work that you're doing in your lab. I am very interested in how this idea of like reversing kind of the evolutionary course actually works. So, could we maybe get into the grit of that a little bit?
Sure. So penicillin. Probably you've heard of penicillin. Probably most people have heard of penicillin. It was one of
Yeah, we all took it when we were kids.
yeah, and it's had this huge impact on society. So it was launched, clinically launched right after D-Day, and saved the lives of all the wounded soldiers from D-Day, so that there was a large enough army to go out and still keep fighting and determine the outcome of World War II. And so, I mean, it is this drug that, like, my dad grew up, he was like, yes, penicillin saved my life. I had pneumonia as a baby. Without penicillin, I would not be alive today. So it's this great drug. It's one of the first antibiotics that was used. And it is still useful for treating syphilis and strep throat. They're still susceptible to it. But most other infections are really resistant to penicillins. So in response to all these infections becoming penicillin resistant, there were other antibiotics that started being used clinically. And one of my favorite classes is the cephalosporins. I love the cephalosporins because those are the ones that saved my sister's life. She actually, on the UTI thing, had a really bad UTI that turned into a kidney infection back when she was 5 and in kindergarten. And she was so sick. And penicillin, the doctors were giving her these massive injections of penicillin. And they just weren't working at all. Her fever was getting worse. She collapsed on the floor New Year's Day. My parents rushed her into the hospital. And then the next day, my mom was going and picking up some things for her from the pharmacy, and she just was crying and crying. And the pharmacist was like, what is going on? So she told him all about it. And he said, there are these great new drugs. They are the cephalosporins, and they're going to save your daughter's life. And they did. And she was this little tiny 5-year-old who weighed 20 pounds. And she was on this little IV at home and at school for 3 months. And it was the saddest thing, but it saved her life. And she's great. She is this thriving, vibrant adult today. And anyway, and so those are the cephalosporins, and those were the wonder drugs in the 1980s. And then after about 15 or 20 years of cephalosporins, and there were multiple generations, we're now up to 5th generation cephalosporins. And resistance to those has evolved, every single one of them. And so then after that, the carbapenems started being used. And those were kind of saved as last resort drugs, at least in the US, but then in some other nations, they were being used as kind of a primary treatment because doctors were getting royalties for the prescriptions that they were giving to patients. And so there was carbapenem resistance emerging out in out in Asia. And then they realized what was happening. And then they changed the prescribing practices so that they don't get royalties for prescribing these drugs. But with every single wave of these new antibiotics that are being introduced, and now we're up to 5th generation cephalosporins, and they're being combined with resistance inhibitors, which bacteria can still become resistant to the resistance inhibitors, but they're combining now different types of drugs together to make them even more powerful and give cephalosporins this added punch so that they can keep treating antibiotics. And there are all these things that people are doing wave after wave of antibiotics, but resistance just seems inevitably to always evolve. And if the genes we know about don't do it, new ones start showing up on plasmids and they get it done. But every time this new kind of resistance evolves to this new class of antibiotics, and it's happened over and over and over again, there's usually a trade-off in resistance to older antibiotics. And so by becoming resistant to the new ones, you become a little bit more susceptible to the old ones. And so we're using this trade-off, whereas you're becoming more resistant to one, you're becoming more susceptible to another. We're using that kind of as the backbone of this idea of reversing resistance. And so it's like, okay, we can apply these antibiotics, and then that should help reverse, that should help bring us back away from resistance to these other antibiotics. So a great example of this, potentially, we have not proven yet that this is what's going on. If you get an ear infection, if a little kid gets an ear infection or they have strep throat, super common things to have happen to a kid, and you go to the doctor and they get prescribed an antibiotic, doctors still very often are going to give them penicillin for this or amoxicillin. Those are really commonly prescribed antibiotics. And it puts the selective pressure on bacteria to stay resistant to penicillin and amoxicillin. And it's not just stay resistant to them, it's be the most resistant to them. And so you actually see in bacteria that are being selected for penicillin resistance, they're going to lose some of the other resistance to maybe later generation cephalosporins by being pressed to become penicillin resistant. Now, you're not going to take somebody who just went through like open heart surgery and give them penicillin. But I think it is interesting to have this idea that if we can apply older drugs more frequently, it will help preserve the newer drugs longer by using the newer drugs less, but also by pushing selection on the bacteria, pushing resistance to be optimized for these older drugs rather than the newer drugs. And so that's kind of the backbone of the idea. But then we're starting to expand it out and to start looking at combinations of genes. So there's this idea that's out there. Okay, maybe this one gene that causes penicillin resistance and cephalosporin resistance, like it has to have mutations to cause cephalosporin resistance, and those mutations make it less good at penicillin resistance. Okay, so you have this one gene kind of on this teeter-totter, but bacteria will just get another gene and another gene and another gene. And so we started looking at that. And I started this a long time ago and asking doctors to send me from their clinical collections bacteria that had multiples of some of these resistance genes. And they said, I would think that my collection would be full of them, but as I actually look at it, it's not full of them. I can't find any. And I did this with doctor after doctor, collection after collection. And these combinations of resistance genes that I was expecting to see just weren't out there. And that's really what seeded this idea that, okay, we have these trade-offs between different mutations, but we might have trade-offs between different genes too. And so we're looking at all kinds of different genes. So in the beginning, it's just like, okay, different mutants of one gene. And they're not stable together. Just having too many genes that are almost identical to each other but differ through a few mutations, that's just not genetically stable. You're going to end up losing lots of those genes. But then as you start putting in even different genes with very different DNA sequences, and they should be genetically stable, it seems like maybe the enzymes that they produce are getting in each other's way and slowing each other down. So we have cases now where like one resistance gene is replacing another resistance gene in bacterial populations. And kind of all the evolutionary theories suggested that those two resistance genes should just abide with each other and make bacteria that much more powerful, because then they have two resistance genes instead of one. But instead we see, no, that's not the way things are going. You can find bacteria with two different resistance genes, but what the trend seems to be is that one resistance gene is actually replacing another. And then another study that I've been working on, we're looking at whole kind of collections of resistance genes. And there are some that tend to occur with each other. And then there are others that are totally excluded, and they seem to not occur with this group. And instead, they have their own group of resistance genes that they hang out with. And so we're seeing all kinds of trade-offs going on here at genes, and even multiple genes hanging out together. And I think if we can start understanding the parameters that are selecting for each of these trade-offs, where if you get one of these, you don't get one of these. If we can start understanding all of those trade-offs, then that starts giving us guidelines for how we can actually prescribe antibiotics. And we go, okay, I know by prescribing this antibiotic, I'm going to be selecting for this kind of resistance. And this kind of resistance is going to be bringing in with it this gene and maybe this whole cluster of genes. But I know that when I'm prescribing this antibiotic, since I'm selecting for these things over here, I'm not selecting for this gene and this whole cluster of genes over here. And then that's where this program time machine comes in, because by understanding those trade-offs, be they at the level of mutations or clear up to clusters of genes, we can start leveraging those trade-offs and going, okay, let's figure out a sequence of antibiotics where we select for this one thing. And in doing so, we know we're selecting against something else, actually. There's this competition that we're aware of that's going on, and we're going to choose who wins. And we're going to choose that for a while. And we know that by choosing this winner, somebody else is decreasing in frequency in this population. And then we can come back at a later time and we still have a handful of antibiotics that are useful to us. We're not going to get to a position where all the antibiotics are useful to us all at once again. But I think that if we're smart about how we apply antibiotics, we can always have some options available. And we just have to, to do that, it would require a lot of organization and cooperation. Yeah.
Yeah, and coordination. But at the same time, it doesn't seem, not feasible, simply because I think that physicians would probably want to be able to use some sort of prescribing protocol. It would actually be in many ways easier for them, because it would take the guesswork out of, okay, this person came to me with this, look it up in my database. This is the thing that, based on the nature of antibiotic resistance in the world right now and in the region where I live, this is what I should prescribe them, instead of like, okay, we're going to give you this now, but then once we get it back from the lab, if it's resistant, we'll probably have to give you the. I mean, when I had MRSA, I had to take 4 different antibiotics.
Yeah, that sounds so miserable.
It was awful. And I think part of that is just because, they were all resistant. I mean, and then I was allergic to one of them and blah, blah, blah. But it can't be good for the state of antibiotic resistance either, to continuously take, for one infection to have to be treated by 4 different types of drug. I mean, that's like massively contributing to the problem.
Sure. And we actually have seen evidence in the past of people being willing to coordinate. So, I mean, way back like 90s, early 2000s, there were hospitals and sometimes even entire countries that were organizing their antibiotic consumption to try to get rid of resistance. And it didn't work. And the sad part of it is that they just were randomly picking which drugs they were rotating between. And I think that's why it didn't work. And so then everybody kind of tossed their hands up in the air and went, well, this doesn't work. And so it was just this place where medicine was way ahead of the science. And now that the science is starting to catch up with what medical practitioners are willing to do, it's like, okay, let's give this another try, please. Please, can we do this again? And I think that as more and more data come out showing that there is merit to this approach, we will start seeing hospitals and countries doing this again. And then especially if we can come up with like, okay, here's the sequence of antibiotics to use. Here, if you're using this one, stop using these guys. As we're able to come up with really specific guidelines about this, it's going to become very useful to the medical community. And I believe that there are enough doctors who really care about this important problem that they will be willing to coordinate and they will be willing to. I think sometimes for doctors, I mean, in a way, having recommendations makes it easier for them because then they maybe don't have to wait for susceptibility testing. And I know that there are doctors who would be on board with that because they're like, I want my patient to live. This very sick patient who just came in, I want them to live.
And I don't want to just be throwing darts at a dartboard. Like, I want to know that, like, this is what I'm supposed to be prescribing. This is the best possible thing. And I got to just look it up. I didn't have to, like, just guess.
Right. But then at another level, too, there are so many considerations that doctors are taking into account. Allergies of the patient or their own individual history of what they've been treated with. And so it can be hard and the doctor's responsibility is always to each individual patient. And so it can be hard to organize doctors, but doctors, bless them, I think are willing. And I think that the points we've raised are the reasons why they would be willing to suspend their own expertise for a minute and just go, okay, let's look at this list. If these antibiotics will work for this patient, we can make this happen.
Well, I think also we have the technology today that a program like this could be implemented as a piece of software where a doctor goes in, they write down the, infection, they write down the drugs that the, person is allergic to or, some stuff on their history. And then algorithm produces what the first line, second line, third line would be for these patients. Instead of having to look at, a piece of paper on a list, for the most part, we're moving. I mean, obviously this wouldn't work so much in clinics in developing areas where the technology isn't there. But even there, cell phones everybody's got them now. I mean, these could be apps that are relatively easy to use. And now that we're moving into electronic medical records across the board, it seems like a pretty seamless integration. Like it would actually make physicians' lives easier, not harder.
I agree with that. I think you should go become a doctor right now. I love these ideas that you're coming up with. I think you're totally on point. And I hope that doctors feel, that they start seeing the same ways. There are, I mean, of course there are doctors who do this, and there are hospitals where they've done this, and there are, pharmacists and hospitals are coming up with recommendations, and I think doctors take them pretty seriously. And doctors, they have a lot of latitude in what they can do to save a patient's life, but they generally do care about the bigger picture too, and about society. And I think most of them try to be really responsible in the practices that they're using in the clinic, both for the patient, but then for society as a whole. And I think you're right that something like this could work and that there would be a lot of doctors excited about doing it.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. So yeah, it's
a great idea, Cara. You're good at this stuff.
No, it's your great idea. I mean, you've been dedicating your life to this. I'm definitely interested. I know we're running a little bit low on time, but I'm interested to know kind of how your career evolved, no pun intended, to get you to this place where this is your research. Like, what did you study in school? Were you always interested in antibiotic resistance? Kind of how did this come to be?
No, I wasn't. I was going to go be a neurosurgeon and repair spinal cords. And I did 3 years of research as an undergraduate and as a lab technician. And I was working with rats, and I was even in contact. Like, there was a lab we collaborated with where they were repairing rat spinal cords. And I was like, after 3 years of it, I was like, this is not what I want to do. And I didn't want to go to medical school. I'd taken the MCAT. I did great. I had good grades, but I was just like, I don't think I can do this. And then I had taken all the cell biology and developmental biology. And I was just like, I don't want to do this forever either. And I hit this whole crisis. And then I had taken one class in evolutionary biology, and I loved it and I was good at it. And in high school, actually, I was really good at evolution, but I just wasn't doing enough enough of it to realize that that's what I was really good at. But I was in this one class and molecular evolution, and it was my favorite class. And I was one of the best students in the class. And I was like, this is it. And I'm going to go to grad school. And so with one class in evolutionary biology, I started applying for all of the top programs in evolutionary biology, and not all of them were willing to take me, amazingly, with only one class in their topic to my name. I did get into University of Rochester, and then I was kind of floating around among all these labs and working with parasitic wasps and fruit flies and all kinds of stuff. And it just was not a hit with any of them. But then I went and there were students there who said, Miriam, you need to go talk to Barry Hall. You might be a good match with him. And Barry Hall was he's a sweet man, but he was known as the local curmudgeon. And he had only had 2 doctoral students before me, and he was nearly at the point of retirement. And he was just like, I don't take students. And I just said, well, can I rotate in your lab? And so he let me do that. And then by the end of it, he said, we seem like we get along pretty well. You could stay in my lab. I can stand to work with you. We're fine together. And so then I stayed there, and he's a fun evolutionary biologist. He was always interested in evolutionary potential, like what are the possibilities for evolution? Like, can we make earthworms fly? Except not really that, but just in bacteria. Just like, how far can we push evolution? And so he was doing all this really kind of crazy and mean, but to bacteria mean stuff of making like these kinds of sugars that they just don't want to eat. Can we make you eat the sugar? And we came in there, and he was like, I'm doing all this metabolic stuff with sugars, but I think that we need to test the system on antibiotics. And so that was my dissertation project. And about, 6 months into it, I was reading all of these papers about antibiotic resistance. And, I remember the first time I read the word septic shock, and I was like, what does this mean? And I looked this up in the dictionary, and I'm reading about liquefaction of organs by bacteria, and I'm reading these papers, and they have all this medical terminology, and I'm looking it up, and I'm understanding that basically there are people dying, kind of rotting from the inside out. And I just sat there and cried and cried and cried. And it was just through these really finding the science. I had this interest in medicine and in taking care of humans. And I think that this intersection of evolutionary biology, which I'm good at, with this human side of things is really what got hold of me. And so then, I did this evolutionary biology PhD, and then I went down to Emory and CDC to do a postdoc down there to really get the medical side, to make sure I understood what was going on there, because evolutionary biologists, really smart people, capable of learning probably anything, but really don't know much about medicine. And I just thought, if I have to talk to the medical community, I really got to go and put myself right in the heart of what's going on medically. So I went to CDC and Emory, and I learned so much about, national surveillance and these emerging resistant strains. And that was so useful to me. And then after that, I was just kind of ready to launch out on my own. And I don't know if you're ever really ready, but I thought I was ready back then. And I did it, and I came to UC Merced. And I was excited about UC Merced because, it's this agricultural area. I was excited about just the demographics here and all these first generation students and minority students. And those were kind of the things that drew me here. I mean, there were places in cold and in hot areas trying to recruit me, but I liked here. And so I came and just got my lab going. And then I don't know. I mean, it's been interesting being kind of here, not in the center of antibiotic research, but kind of in the center of antibiotic consumption and seeing how antibiotic consumption is happening in the Central Valley and learning more about all the agricultural use and having a good hospital to collaborate with where I can really see firsthand the medical use and what's happening there, and so those things, and then great collaborators, and there's this really great community in antibiotic resistance research. I'm sure that there's some competitiveness in it, but there's so much cooperation going on and people talk to each other about what's happening. So through all of those things, that's really shaped my career. And then I think kind of even being alone, there are other people now studying drug resistance here at UC Merced, but I think that for a while, kind of being the only one here as founding faculty doing this thing, it really just gave me the room and the opportunity to explore ideas that other people really weren't thinking about. And it's been fun to do that. And then also being in this great UC network, there are all these mathematicians. And right now, so much of my research has been shaped and driven by these just powerful mathematicians that I work with. Here at UC Merced, Suzanne Cindy, I mean, she is this powerhouse. She knows evolution, but she knows so much math, and she's kind of like you because she asks such pointed questions about biology. And she's like, no, this isn't my area of expertise, but she, like, the questions she asks really end up shaping things because they're just such good questions. And so I think that all of these things are what has shaped my career. I kind of study antibiotic resistance. There are more people studying it kind of in the same way that I do. Don Anderson over in Sweden and Roy Kashoni over in Israel. They study things kind of in a similar way that I do, but I kind of went a weird direction with studying antibiotic resistance, and it's really just been questioning what is happening and why aren't things behaving the way we believe they should. And all these mathematicians that I work with, they're so good at asking these questions too. And they really kind of feed this way of looking at science. Like, okay, let's make a prediction. Things should be acting this way. Well, they're not. Okay, we need to go learn more. And so, I don't know, I guess just a lot of good fortune in being around really smart people who care about this issue has really been what has shaped my career. I don't know. That's a really long explanation for it.
I love it. And I love hearing from researchers and, people in the STEM fields who find something that they're passionate about throughout the experience. I think a lot of times when we're young, we think we know what we want out of life. We think we know what we want to do when we grow up. And then we take all sorts of twists and turns. And then we realize that maybe the thing that we thought we wanted to do isn't quite catching us the way that this other thing does catch us. And you can feel the difference, right? When you
Totally.
focus in on something and you go, man, this is interesting. Like, I just want to spend all my time reading about this. That tells you something.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who's listening right now, if you're having that experience or if you're not having that experience, that can be telling, especially when it comes to research. You have to really care about what you're researching because it's a grind.
Research is brutal. It is so brutal. Yeah. And there are so many times I'm like, why am I doing this? And then I get some beautiful data and I fall in love with it all over again. And I'm like, oh, this is why I'm doing it. And maybe sometimes, maybe someday I will help humans be healthier. And that's the real goal. But sometimes there are just these little tiny successes along the way. And it's like, oh, this could make a difference. Okay, I'll keep going for a while longer.
Yeah. Well, Miriam, I always end my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions. And given that you have really dedicated your career to understanding bacteria, bacterial resistance, and or bacterial resistance to antibiotics, and the community health portions of this, I'm actually fascinated to hear what your take is going to be on these two questions. And of course, they don't have to have anything to do with your work, so keep that in mind.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so they're big picture questions. So what I want to know from you is, number one, when you think about the future in, whatever context is relevant to you right now. So it could be the future of your work, it could be, your family, it could be personal, or it could be like global, cosmic, wherever your head goes. Number one, I want to know, what is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you're most worried about, maybe cynical about, or at least, kind of not, things aren't looking good in this boat and you're concerned about it. And then on the flip side of that, what is the thing that you're genuinely, and, passionately kind of optimistic about? What are you hopeful for?
Okay, so we'll start with the downer first and then on a positive note. I
Yep.
think the thing that's worrying me the most these days, and it's not anything I do research about, but I really worry about plastic. And
Mm-hmm.
and I still use more plastic. I look in my trash can and I'm like, yep, still a lot of plastic in that trash can. But I mean, I've started making my own yogurt so I don't have to use plastic yogurt containers. And I buy milk in the cardboard cartons instead of plastic cartons, and just things like that. And I guess I really worry about, I don't know, about the environment. I worry about lots of things, but the environment is one of the big ones right now. And I think it's on a lot of people's minds these days. And it's like, suddenly we're just aware of like the shortfalls in recycling and how much plastic is in the ocean. And it's like, I've been contributing to this my whole life and I didn't even know. And then this abrupt, like, I have to change my ways, but then it's really hard to change them. And so, kind of at a personal, but also a cosmic, well, at least a global level, that is kind of the part that worries me. I think some of the stuff that is the most hopeful to me is it's really about bacteria. I love bacteria. I don't love antibiotic resistance and infections, of course, but bacteria seem to have the solutions maybe for saving the planet. And so um, I have a colleague here, Becca Riles, and she studies compost and like carbon farming. And she was showing us, I just went to this little presentation for the community that she did a few nights ago that's done by our podcast group, Radio Bio. And she was talking about her research where she has found that just by spreading this thin layer of composted manure on soil, it sequesters all of this carbon. And that if we could spread composted manure on only 5% of the grass and rangeland in California, it would offset the carbon footprint of all of our agriculture. And I think it was also industrial production going on here. And it's because these wonderful microbes, when they're composting things, they break them down, they're breaking down carbon-based molecules, but they're not just returning them to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or as methane. And they're actually sequestering them away in these complex molecules that can go into the soil, fertilize it, make it better for grazing cattle, make it more fertile soil. And it's also can offset global warming. And you don't even have to do it to that much of the earth for this to work. And at the end of that talk, I was like, Becca, you're going to save the world.
Yeah.
It's nice to study
Yeah.
solutions and not just problems. And so I think that's one of the most hopeful things. I'm like, wait, there are all these ways where we feel like we're destroying the planet, but there are bacteria who have been around a lot longer than we have and who have lived through all kinds of ridiculously tough circumstances and have found solutions to them. And so maybe we can tap those solutions and save the planet.
Very cool. I love it. Well, gosh, Miriam, this has been a fascinating chat. I'm so glad that you
Oh,
were
I
able
love
to take
talking to you,
time
Cara.
away. Yeah, it was so much fun. I know that that the people listening were probably just as interested as I am. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and so I was especially interested to be able to dive deep with you today.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do that. I had a great time talking with you. And I hope you feel better and better every day.
Thank you.
And really
I'm drinking a
fast.
lot of water, so hopefully that helps.
Good. Yes. I'm like, these are all things I forgot. Drink water, wash your hands, get vaccinated, all these things. Yes. Good.
Oh,
Good.
gosh. Well, gosh, thank you again so much. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.